Good morning and welcome to Our Issues Milwaukee. I'm your host, Andrea Williams, and our focus this morning is on mental health. 1 in 4 adults, approximately 61.5 million Americans, experience mental illness in a given year. 1 in 17, that's about 13.6 million, live with a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, major depression, or bipolar depression. Serious mental illness costs America $193.2 billion in lost earnings per year. And my first guest represents an organization that's the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization dedicated to building better lives for the millions of Americans affected by mental illness. Brenda Wesley is the Director of Education and Outreach for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, also known as NAMI, Greater Milwaukee. How are you, Brenda?
Good morning. How are you?
Always a pleasure to have you here.
I know. Thanks a lot for having me.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, tell us more about NAMI and what it is you do on a daily basis.
Well, NAMI is a grassroots nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated in improving the lives of people that live with a mental health diagnosis as well as their family members. And we do this through research, but that's mainly done by a national organization, but the advocacy work that we do, the education and outreach that we do, and the support that we offer, again, those living with a mental health disorder and family members.
Wow. And throughout the month of October, there has been special emphasis placed on mental health. October the 11th through the 17th was actually Mental Illness Awareness Week. So in a nutshell, what do our viewers at home need to be aware of when it comes to mental health?
When we think of mental health and mental illness, I say that there's mental illness, there's mental health, and mental wellness. There are people that can have a mental illness and do very well and can be mentally well. And then we have people that don't live with a mental illness that may be mentally unhealthy. But mental illness, and that's what we're talking about, it's a plethora of diagnoses that people can live with. You put it up under an umbrella, and there's so many different diagnoses. The main ones that get a lot of press is bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, eating disorders, OCD, major depression, anxiety disorders. Those are just a few, but to just reiterate that mental illness can really be on a spectrum, as well as there's so many different diagnoses as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because there are individuals who have heard of eating disorders, of course, and anxiety disorders, all these different things, but they really don't pair them or look at them the same as bipolarism or schizophrenia, but they all really do fall under the umbrella of mental health.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the people are more empathetic when you're talking to a youngster or someone dealing with an eating disorder versus schizophrenia, because even in in the media is that mental illness, especially schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, is, a lot of people can make fun of these disorders and kind of stigmatize these disorders versus, and then we lose empathy of what an individual is going through because it's a brain disorder. Mental illness is not a character issue, it's an actual brain disorder. And maybe that's how we should start framing it, as a brain disorder instead of a mental illness.
Yeah, because you hear people when you talk about a stigma, there are people, and I say this because I want people to be more aware when they're talking in their everyday conversation, they'll describe somebody as being bipolar and not really give thought to maybe somebody that's standing around maybe taking medication for being bipolar, and that makes it harder for people to be open about what it is they're dealing with on a daily basis. So we've had conversations where, we talk about people using the word crazy so freely, and it's just something to be aware of, and that's why you have things like Awareness Week and Awareness Month and things of that nature.
So you're right, and so we can talk about it, because if 1 in 4 adults will be diagnosed with a mental health disorder in any given year, and even among youth, there's the diagnosis is very high with youth living with a mental health disorder. I think it's how we frame it and how we discuss it. When we say that someone is a bipolar, we should use, and what's going on across the nation is called person-first language, is not to call the individual by their illness, but to call an individual by their name and say that they're living with an illness. So people are not bipolar. I mean, that's not who they are. They're an individual living with bipolar disorder. We use the word schizophrenia, and people living with schizophrenia, we call them schizophrenic. How stigmatizing is that? Is that the only thing that you see in me is that you're calling me a schizophrenic? But if I'm living with schizophrenia, I have a name, and I'm living with this disorder. Even children living with ADHD. We say that kid is so ADHD, but that child has a name and they're living with an illness called ADHD. And we don't do that with any other illnesses. We don't, if you were living with cancer, if you were diagnosed with cancer, I wouldn't say, this is my friend Andrea, and she's a cancer. Oh my God, she's a cancer.
Wow.
They would give your name first and say, my friend was diagnosed with cancer. So we have to do that with mental illness as well. And that's part of the awareness, is not looking at the person as the illness, but looking at them as a person living with a mental health disorder.
Yeah, and what I was talking about in particular is people using it as a descriptive word.
Yes.
With people who really aren't living with it. Oh, she's so bipolar.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's what people have to be more aware
and
of.
making fun of it, because if a behavior is kind of different, is that, or you're so bipolar, or they make comments, did you take your medicine? Oh no, she missed her medicine today. Do we make fun? I say that mental illness is the last frontier that we can openly and honestly make fun of people and not be ashamed by our actions.
Wow.
We don't do that with any other illness. We don't make fun and use those analogies with people living with any other illness except for mental health.
Very good point there. And the thing about NAMI, you have a lot of support groups, not only for individuals who are living with mental illness, but also for their families and their close friends, because when someone has been diagnosed, there are more chances than none that everybody that's close to them or loves them has to be aware of how to deal with this and how to better understand what they have to go through on a daily basis.
Right, because they don't understand the behavior. And again, when I go back and say that, you look at it as being a character issue instead of looking at it being a brain disorder as well. So we do provide, it's a 12-week course that we provide to family members of how to understand your loved one's illness, medication management, how to advocate for your loved one, but in general, to understand that your loved one is living with an illness. Because when my son received his diagnosis, there was no education. They just gave us a bunch of medication and said, give this to him, and that's all we got. We didn't understand the behavior. We didn't understand the medication management. We didn't understand that his life was going to be different. We didn't understand that our life was going to be different. So we provide this service for families, because the most important thing in recovery, and I think that's with any other illness, is support. Not only support from the family, but support from the community. So we do training to train the community to understand what mental illness is about as well.
All right, and when it comes to mental health, there's this reoccurring subject that continues to make the headlines, and that is gun reform and mental health laws. So you have recent mass shootings that make reforming gun and mental health laws more urgent for lawmakers. And it's Pennsylvania Representative Tim Murphy who introduced a bill, the Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act, which would restructure certain parts of the federal mental health system to focus on ensuring treatment for the 4% of mental health patients who are the most seriously ill. And this particular bill has bipartisan support. So the new focus is important to lawmakers, and there's a lot of pressure being put on them every time we see a mass shooting. There are a number of the shooters who have been persons with severe mental illness, and their illness, when paired with easy access to guns, is a recipe for disaster in many ways. So what are your thoughts when we talk about this in particular?
That burns me up. I can tell you that, is that we should be having the discussion about better services around mental health, and we should have a discussion about gun control. These should be two separate discussions. Is that the only time we have a discussion on a national level is if there is violence. But there are statistics that show that people living with a mental illness are no more violent than you or I. So the discussion because mental illness is still so stigmatized as well. So the only thing the public will understand is that, oh my goodness, is someone with a mental illness, they have a gun, and they're going to shoot up a theater or whatever. But we have to look at the statistics on gun violence. There is a lot of deaths that occur due to gun violence by people not living with a mental illness. But we don't have that as a discussion. So that just really burns me that we're putting them side by side. And definitely they should not. It's a discussion to be had here, and then we should have the discussion with better treatment, better services in the community, better hospital system when we look at mental health, and not to equate it, just have this national discussion on it, because again, we're stigmatizing the illness. And I just have to say is that there's many shootings by people with guns that they don't live with a mental health disorder.
So your concern is that, yes, there have been a few of them who have fallen under that category, but you feel like that's going to put people who are living with a mental illness into this whole other scenario where they too are stigmatized by what someone else has done.
Absolutely.
I get it.
Yes.
With that said, NAMI and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, you have collaborated, and this is huge because you talk about a lot of young people who are usually diagnosed in their 20s or their late teens. Yeah. So this is a good partnership in making people aware at that age where they could be dealing with some of the signs and symptoms.
Absolutely. We just have a wonderful partnership with them where they're really just trying to engage the schools and also teach the professors is that you need to know what to look for. Or you may have a student that's coming in that has a diagnosis of a mental illness. They're not doing well, but instead of casting that student off, because you wouldn't do that with any other student with any other illness, is that to train professors and administration, but also to get out in the community to tell the students that if you're going through, that they have a counseling service for them. So they're looking at a 3-tier situation that they can get the word out in regards to mental health across the board. Because people can do very well when they live with a severe and chronic mental health disorder. And so we have to provide services and education and the understanding that's needed. Again, when we look at any other illness, we tend to help people alone, but when we look at mental health disorders, it's still greatly stigmatized. So that partnership with UWM is just fabulous.
Yeah,
Yes.
I thought it was awesome to see that, and it has been decided that Milwaukee police officers will be equipped with body cameras by this time next year, and NAMI actually helps train Milwaukee police officers when it comes to dealing with individuals who they may assume has an illness or someone that it quite obviously does. So, and this is so important, especially in the community where we've seen this scenario, and you were here to talk about this particular scenario at the time with the former Milwaukee police officer encountering Dontre Hamilton at Red Arrow Park, and that whole conversation was taking place. So tell the people at home how in fact you go about training Milwaukee police officers.
You know, and that should be another show.
In itself.
We have our crisis interteam training that we train police officers to identify if someone is going into a crisis, if it's a mental health crisis. So, and how to de-escalate and de-escalate a situation when they see that the person may be escalating. So we teach them not to put hands on, but to actually talk to that individual, to calm that individual down, and that too, because we have a very high rate of what we call emergency detention, and Milwaukee police officers, they're the only ones that can take someone into custody and emergency detain them at the mental health complex. So we're trying to teach the officers to voluntarily talk to that person to get them to sign themselves into the hospital, or not to incarcerate the individual, because there's a high number of people with a mental health disorder that's incarcerated. But I just want to say is that our mayor has mandated that all law enforcement officers should be trained in CIT. I am totally against that. I think that law enforcement officers should be trained in mental health, but CIT is a program that was developed where we need highly trained and highly skilled officers to be part of a division that goes out and helps doctors to assess whether someone should be emergency detained or not. Just like we have divisions for hostage negotiation, the SWAT team, it's a division because we need officers to be empathetic and understanding around mental health. So again, I think all officers should have mental health training, but we need a division of officers that's highly skilled and trained to work with the mental health community when they are dispatched out to a particular situation.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. And of course, I want you to stick around so we can continue talking about the outstanding things that NAMI does. And when we return to Our Issues Milwaukee, we'll have that conversation about NAMI Greater Milwaukee, and we'll find out more about a coalition that's working to reduce the stigma that comes with mental illness. We'll do that right after this.